name's Cory Anderson, and I'm the Executive Vice President at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation here in Little Rock, where for the last 45 years we've been working hard to build a better Arkansas for all Arkansans. Over that time, we've focused on issues of economic, educational, race, and social justice, and invested nearly $150 million right here in Arkansas in community organizations, communities, and all of our state and local systems, again, working hard to help make those systems relevant to the people that really need them, following on the legacy of Governor Winthrop Rockefeller. My job here today is to facilitate this panel on public policy, community, and faith-based organizations. And this actually, I think, follows really well on the end of Dr. Penderhugh's presentation when the young lady in the back asked, well, what do you do? You know, how do you get people that control the purse strings and the resources and can help us really make change in what we call at scale, so change for everybody? Like, what do you do? How do you get people to actually make the public policy decisions and put the resources and the places and the programs and the ideas like Dr. Penderhugh's talked about? So today's panel, we've got representation, I think, across all of the major institutions that represent some of those systems. And what we'll talk about today in this panel, and we'll need you all's help with your questions, is just that question. You know, what does it mean to move public policy? What does it mean to move community? What does it mean to move our faith-based organizations in the direction that will help all of you that are doing the work with families, that are doing the work in communities, but in a direction that will help all of you do that work more effectively, more efficiently, and with higher and deeper and broader levels of impact. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but let me give you the first line of their bio. With us we have Sara Bishop, who is a faculty member in the Department of Communications at the U of A in Fayetteville, and she teaches several courses related to strategic communications for a nonprofit. If you are a reader at any level of literacy, you probably know our next panelist, Rex Nelson, one of the most, may be the most high-profile writer in Arkansas, but currently writes 3 columns a week for the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, and has written about just about everything Arkansas for a long time. We have Pastor Adron Poole, who's a 27-year resident of Blytheville, but reared in southeast Arkansas, the wonderful booming metropolis of Wabaseka. He and I have already connected over the country folks that we know. And then Rodger Jowers, who serves as regional coordinator for the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth, but probably the most important thing about him is he graduated high school in Jacksonville, so he knows a little bit about Arkansas. So the way this will work, each of these panelists has a story to tell us. They'll tell us their story. We'll walk through that. I'm going to throw a couple of questions at them just to get a little bit deeper, and then we're going to engage in a dialogue between you and our panelists. So we'll start with Sara.
When I was first approached about speaking at this year's conference, I was deeply honored and excited. That is until I looked at the calendar and then looked at the map. Off the Baptist Health exit ramp, for years, that exit sign alone would fill me with a sense of dread. And give a talk about resilience? Well, sometimes the universe just seems to speak to you so loudly that all you can do is surrender. So here I am. This picture is of my husband, John, and our 3 oldest kids. Taken in 2008, shortly before we moved from New York City to Berryville, Arkansas. From a real booming metropolis of 8.5 million people to a small rural farming community of just a couple thousand. Because you see, John had been really unhappy in his career for some time, feeling compelled to pursue a different vocation, one marked more by hands-on work and service, say, than cubicles and spreadsheets. He initially pitched moving our family to a small town in northern Honduras where we'd be working with orphaned and abandoned children. Now, mind you, we had 3 very small children at the time. So I thought I smartly countered with the idea to perhaps look into his hometown in Arkansas, a place I knew he loved and seemed infinitely more cosmopolitan than the alternative. And so we did, and he relished in telling people then that moving back to Berryville was his wife's idea and not his own. It was a brilliant move on his part. 7 weeks into literally our Green Acres experiment, we learned we were pregnant with our 4th child. Our friends joked that we could basically start our own 4-H club with just our own kids. But shortly after we moved, our dreams of a new beginning, a new start, were cruelly interrupted when a 4,000-pound steel bucket fell on my husband's head while he was doing excavation work. He suffered a massive traumatic brain injury that involved 30 days in ICU, 84 days in acute rehab, and 1 fatal pulmonary embolism. So you see, 10 years ago, this very week, my husband died in the middle of a physical therapy session just a few blocks away from where I stand. I was 31 years old, pregnant, widowed, with 3 children under the age of 5, no job in a state I had just moved to, and now saddled with a $500,000 medical bill. And this is my family today. Sam, Kate, Johnny, now Peter, and my husband Anthony, whom I married in 2016. What do you see in this picture? Armed with just a few brief facts about my story, how do you feel? Sad? Scared? Anxious? Maybe, but you probably feel relieved because you see what most people who hear my story see. You see resilience. And we are, in many ways, my children in particular, a shining example of resilience in the face of unspeakable and unimaginable tragedy. But what I want to talk to you today is about what you can't see in that picture. What's missing in that brief sequence from tragedy to triumph. Something so big that without it, you don't ever fully understand our story. Indeed, the loss, the desperation, the uncertainty, the sadness, the despair, the loneliness, the toxic stress. Of course, you can assume that was all there at some point. But what's missing is the how. How did we get from point A to point B? How did we get from there to here? How did we accept the cards that we were dealt and build a new future? How did we move forward? Here's the funny thing. Most people don't ask me those questions because they don't think they need to. They assume they know what they are because they've seen similar stories with similar endings their entire lives. They don't need to see the mechanisms of resilience to know that they must be the same character traits and action sequences of a familiar script, a script that can be summed up by a story we all know and love, that little engine that could. This story about a little train that overcomes an impossible task just by believing in himself and working hard has clawed its way deep into American culture and benefits from its resonance with sacred American values of rugged individualism, the democratic ideals of equality, merit-based principles of capitalism, and even the basic tenets of reformational theology. All these different systems of thoughts, and behavior work together to create what we call the American dream, where rags to riches stories and comebacks are explained by the power of the human spirit, a spirit that is fueled by a simple commitment to hard work, determination, and personal responsibility. The power of this American dream backdrop lies not in how we now can successfully predict the ending of blockbuster movies, but in how it provides Americans with a shorthand explanation for why some people make it and others don't. If you're successful, you worked hard. If you're struggling, well, work harder. As advocates talking about resilience, this narrow formula of success has enormous consequences on your ability to cultivate support for children and adolescents struggling to overcome even harder grief, tragedy, abuse, and neglect. While young children, it is true, elicit strong feelings of care and protection from wide audiences, blame is routinely placed on the action and choices of their parents, with little regard to the environments in which those choices and actions are made. As children get older and their decisions have consequences, we begin to measure our support based on evidence of good decisions. Are they doing well in school? Are they staying out of trouble? Are they refusing to play victim and making plans for a better future? By the time children reach adulthood, this little engine that could script kicks into high gear and becomes the story that Americans tell themselves about how, when, and why we provide social supports to individuals at all. Whether you're stopped at an intersection with a panhandler approaching your window or exercising your right to vote on public interventions, the tension in this script always revolves around the worthiness of an individual, which is largely determined by our shorthand assessments of their work ethic and sense of personal responsibility. As advocates, this can make us really angry, and we often rail against our opponents for seeming uncaring or even greedy, blind to an environment that creates so many vulnerabilities that are outside an individual's control. But we must acknowledge that that's not the story the public is most familiar with. That is not the story that graces the pages of Sports Illustrated or Forbes magazine. That is not even the story that we ourselves tell about our own personal lives. Resilience, as you all know, is not determined by individual character or hard work alone, but rather by an environment that our eyes are trained not to see. So let's put our glasses on for just a second. In this picture of resilience, let me tell you what you can't see. You can't see the workers' compensation policy that covered 100% of our $500,000 medical bill, including funeral expenses. You can't see our financial savings and that of our extended family and friends that covered basic needs, multiple moves, mortgages, childcare, and counseling and therapy. You can't see my debt-free advanced degrees paid for by my parents and grandparents that allowed me to secure a flexible and meaningful job as a single mom. You can't see my financial advisor and my personal attorney working to create protections and assurances that I didn't even know that I needed. And most importantly, you can't see the life insurance that created an overall umbrella of security that minimized our collective stress that we felt as a family and continues the cycle of opportunities for the next generation. Now, for my kids too, you can't see all the team sports, the after-school programs, the summer camps, and the travel that nurtured their health, their self-confidence, and their independence. No, you don't see any of that. So when people hear my story, they fill in the blanks. based on a familiar script of I think I can, success, and resilience. You must be the strongest person I know. And who doesn't enjoy hearing that? Besides, life insurance, low-interest mortgage rates, and compound interest don't exactly make for great storytelling, people. But what's the cost of editing those factors from the script of our own personal lives? Well, it's a high one that is carried disproportionately on the backs of people who are already struggling the most. It's a cost that perpetuates the myth that poor outcomes are the consequences of poor choices. It's a cost that demonizes victims as lazy and absolves the rest of us from playing any part in a solution. It's a cost that labels advocates for public interventions as un-American. And it's a cost to the truth about the world we all really live in. Gaps in assets and opportunities, not character, eventually become gaps in achievements and outcomes. Of course, individual choices and actions do matter, but the environments in which those choices and actions are made are more important. Yet these contexts, particularly as they relate to the construction of well-being and resilience, remain invisible, or at best only exist in that background of our dominant frame of individualism that drives our storytelling culture. Stories don't change overnight, but if we are to successfully engage the larger public in our work, we must begin to flip that little engine script and make the invisible more visible. How? First, reframe your own story of success and resilience, and then trigger others to do the same. How people make sense of their own lives creates a mental shortcut for then how they make sense of other people's lives. And it's much easier to persuade someone about something they already know than something they don't know. So start with your own story. What supports and opportunities did you have available to you? Can you share credit for your success in ways that aren't overly apologetic or guilt-induced, but rather brings to the forefront the role your environment played in shaping your life's experiences? And can you have that conversation with your personal and professional network? Getting into the habit of identifying the positive supports that lead to success will help our community better understand how the absence of those supports limits others' potential. Focus on context. Setting the scene is an essential component of any good story. And so in your enthusiasm to embrace storytelling in your work and your advocacy, be sure to zoom out and include a landscape that has so many vulnerabilities and barriers, yet lacks the opportunities to overcome them. Connecting the dots on how well-being and resilience are built is not a radical or even a partisan concept. It makes sense. It's just not the loudest story out there. So let's change that. Third, align mission with values. The values of individualism, hard work, and personal responsibility are not going anywhere, nor should they. They don't need to be resented or even replaced, but rather we should demonstrate how the status quo threatens those values. When adverse childhood experiences create such an uneven playing field later on, all Americans lose, for our values are not matched by our reality. And finally, underneath that, it says connect to a larger vision. Now more than ever, as strategic communicators, we need to look upstream and answer the question that Americans are always asking themselves: why should I care? And demonstrate how investments today benefit all of us later. A stronger peer system of ACE initiatives has the power to create safer, healthier, more prosperous environments for everyone to thrive. But we can't assume that those connections are well understood. Focusing on potential of individuals, of families, of neighborhoods, of schools, of businesses, creates a very productive terrain to then talk about solutions. Somewhere I once read that we don't acknowledge or critique systems while we are enjoying its fruits. 10 years ago today, I most certainly could not see how a vast network of systems full of supports and opportunities would bear abundant fruit to me and my family and so little to others experiencing similar grief, uncertainty, tragedy, and worse, violence, perpetual violence. And yet, I'm held up in my community as a symbol of success, of strength, and determination, while others are marginalized, criminalized, and ignored. Because that's how the familiar story ends, unless we begin to change the script. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you for your powerful story, Sara. You know, I was invited here when I got the email because they said we had heard you give a talk at a state obesity conference, and it came out of some frustration that I had in the matter of policy. So I'm going to talk more about public policy this morning. In 2005, I left a job I had held for more than 9 years as the Communications and Policy Director in the governor's office when I received an appointment from President George W. Bush to an organization called the Delta Regional Authority. Delta Regional Authority does economic and community development in parts of 8 states, including a large part of Arkansas. And over the next 4 years, I traveled well over 100,000 miles, giving speeches, sitting in meetings in those 8 states. Most of those areas are rural areas, and most of those areas were and continue to lose population. Now let me tell you how my frustration built over those 4 years. As I would go into a town, usually community leaders in that community would come forward, and I'm from the federal government, right? So what are they doing? They're putting their hands out and saying, give us a grant. We did have a grant program at the DRA. And so often, when you would ask them, what are you going to do with that grant, the answer was always the same. The answer was, we're going to buy some land out here on the edge of town. We are going to run in some water and sewer lines. Many of you can relate to this in your own communities, I know. We're going to run in some electrical lines. We're going to maybe even throw up a spec building so some manufacturer may show up. We'll already have a building for them. And we're going to put a nice brick sign out on the highway that says County Industrial Park or County Business Park. And then you would come back. You would come back a couple of years later and they would say, well, what happened? Nothing's out there. And I would want to scream, and I wouldn't because I was one of the political appointees, so I had to be a little bit politic. Now I'm back to full-time newspaper writing, and I don't have to be politic at all. I can say what I really think. But I would want to scream in a lot of these communities, have you looked at your public school system? It's not very good. Have you looked at your health care in your community? It's not very good. Have you looked at race relations in your community? Not good at all. Have you driven around and noticed the weeds and the trash everywhere? That makes an impression on visitors. Have you looked at your downtown? 3/4 of the storefronts are empty. You are stuck in a 1950s and 1960s mode of industrial development that is long gone, and you are living in an era of community development, when what is important is not developing infrastructure as much as it is developing people. And you have your priorities all wrong. I mentioned a 1950s and 1960s mode of economic development. Let me elaborate just for a minute. I will hurry here, but you may not realize this, I didn't either until I found a government document a few years ago. From 1940 to 1960, guess what state in those 20 years lost a higher percentage of its population than any other state in the Union? Arkansas. After World War II, we had seen all kinds of research and development that grew up around the war effort, and it also affected agriculture. And suddenly we saw this mass mechanization of agriculture. And so the mechanical cotton picker came along. Not only that, along came improved seed varieties, improved insecticides, improved herbicides. And so if you own land, that was a good thing, because you could do your work with far fewer people. If you owned a cotton plantation in East Arkansas, and I'm pulling a number out of the air to illustrate, if you owned a cotton plantation in East Arkansas and it took 200 people to raise a crop of cotton before the war, suddenly you could do it with 20 people after the war. Now you can do it with 2 or 3 and get record yields, because after the war, suddenly along came the mechanical cotton picker. And again, along came better seed varieties. And so you didn't have to have huge numbers of people out in those fields chopping cotton in the summer. These folks with Southeast Arkansas roots know what chopping cotton is. Some may not. Picking cotton by hand in the fall. And so if you own land, that was a great thing. The vast majority of Arkansans, however, didn't own land. They were sharecroppers. They were tenant farmers. But they could find work elsewhere. And so they went to Chicago. They went to Cleveland. They went to Gary, Indiana. They went to Cincinnati. They went to Pittsburgh, and they found work. And they stayed, and Arkansas was bleeding population. So what did we do? We created the Arkansas Industrial Development Commission. We made Winthrop Rockefeller, who had moved here in 1953 from New York, the first chairman, because anybody would answer a call from a Rockefeller. And we started recruiting cut and sew operations. And we started recruiting shoe factories, and we had some success. When I was growing up in Arkadelphia, we made jeans at Levi's, we made work clothes at Oberman, we made bras at Hollywood Bassarette. All those jobs, of course, are long gone. But we had some success for a while replacing some of those farm jobs. But again, those jobs soon left, because what was our selling point back in those years? It was to go to the upper Midwest and the Northeast and say, we have good, hardworking people, which we do, but we don't have unions. And so, Mr. Plant Owner, your cost of labor is much less in Arkansas, and your profit margin is going to be higher. That's how we attracted them. Well, we got beat at our own game. Those types of jobs soon moved south of the border to Mexico and Central America. They've since left there and gone to China and Southeast Asia, where the cost of labor is even less. But so many of our community leaders are still in that old mindset of, we're going to attract the big factory. Go home and look what your chamber's doing. Look what your so-called economic developers are doing. We're going to attract the big factory. And we're going to bring 400 jobs, 500 jobs at town at once. It's not going to happen in most of these places. And that's what I wanted to tell them. Because your priorities are all wrong. Your priorities need to be on your people that are there now. And your chance of, I call it the Acme Widget Company, your chance of landing the Acme Widget Company that's suddenly going to bring 500 people to town is not really good. But let me tell you what happens. If you make your public school system as good as it possibly can be, if you improve health care in your community, then that boy or girl who grew up there, maybe in Arkadelphia where I grew up, it may be Berryville, maybe any town around Arkansas, who went off somewhere else to college, who worked somewhere else, might look back and see, you know, I'm about to raise a family, and this is a pretty good place to raise a family. And that boy or girl may come back there as an adult and may start a business. You might start out with 2 or 3, but you might get lucky and they might have 20 employees after 5 years. You might get really lucky. They might have 100 employees after 10 years if it takes off. Isn't your investment greater there than chasing those smokestacks and trying to get the big industry? So it's about priorities. And again, I think our priorities still are wrong in this state. Economic development in the 21st century is no longer about chasing manufacturing plants. It's about chasing knowledge. We live in a knowledge-based economy. And you've got to create an environment where smart people want to live. And how do you do that? Education and health care have to be the priorities. I'll close with this, and I'll give you a sneak preview of my column that'll appear on the editorial page of Sunday's Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, because I wrote it yesterday afternoon while it was fresh on my mind. I had lunch yesterday with the new chancellor of the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, Cam Patterson. He is a nationally renowned cardiologist, came to our state knowing what the financial problems were at UAMS, knowing what he was facing from New York City. He is from Mobile, Alabama. He was ready to get his family back to the South. But I got to thinking as I visited with him that he is one of the most important people in our state right now. We live at a time where 2/3 of our state is losing population. Now, here's the anomaly. Arkansas, when the 2020 census comes out, will have gained population as a state from 2010 to 2020, and yet more than 40 of our 75 counties will have lost population. So we will have gained population as a state, but I'm thinking now, because I'm weird and study these kind of numbers, 41, 42, 43 counties of the 75 will have lost population from 2010 to 2020. Now, what does that mean? That means fewer rural doctors, fewer rural hospitals, fewer rural medical clinics, and it makes that whole mission of telemedicine that UAMS is involved in more important than ever. So he is, again, I think one of the most important people in Arkansas right now, but he comes at a time where our legislature, and I'm not here to give a political speech, but where our legislature has been, unfortunately, like many of those small town economic developers that I dealt with at the DRA, and that is the priorities are all wrong. They have been systematically starving UAMS for years now from a financial standpoint, and we're beginning to pay for it as a state. Because now we're having companies say, well, where's the workforce? Well, what's here is not healthy, and a lot of it is we're not funding things correctly. So again, I'll close. I've already gone too long, but I will close by saying we have to work with our leaders. You have to work with your business and civic leaders in the communities where you are. You have to work with your legislators, and we have to change the whole definition of economic development in a state that has long, going back to, again, the 50s, the 40s, had a focus on how do we grow, how do we turn this place around. It's not about chasing smokestacks. It's about improving the lives of the children who will be the workforce and the adults and the parents of the future. You do that from education, you do it from health care. That is economic development in the 21st century. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Cory's right. One of the worst mistakes you can make is put a microphone in front of a preacher. I want to first begin by saying I think we ought to get Sara another hand because I think she's defined what resilience is in the best possible way that it can be summed up. I'm here to tell my story. What's been the driving force behind the things that we've been inspired to do. I can relate to her more so than probably anybody in the room, I'm originally from a small town that Cory told you about, a little town called Wabaseka. A lot of great people come from Wabaseka. I'm proud of them. Little Rock, too, has a bittersweet pill for me. If I can just share a little bit. August 2014, I had a daughter who was currently 27 years of age, about 5'11", beautiful, successful. Came home one day wearing her pumps, complaining about her knee hurting. The father that I am, I just looked at her and said, if you get out those tall shoes, you probably feel better. Little did I know, my daughter had a tumor that had developed in her knee, osteosarcoma, juvenile cancer in a 27-year-old woman. 4 years later, at the age of 31, we lost her. She was the mother of a 9-year-old child, beautiful young boy, Tadarian Isaiah. With her death comes a responsibility. Somebody's got to raise this kid. Fortunately, he had a beautiful father, even though they were not married, had a wonderful dad. Upon her deathbed, we all agreed that he should be the one who raised his son, proved more than capable, willing, ready to do everything needed and necessary. December 19th, 2016, he was a truck driver. 20 miles outside of our city of Blytheville, Arkansas, I got a phone call about 9 o'clock in the morning that I need to rush down Interstate 55 because PJ had been killed in a trucking accident. So here's this 9-year-old child who's currently 11 years old, has lost his mother to cancer, his father to a trucking accident. His grandfather, whom he was very, very close to, was suffering from a heart condition, on a pacemaker. November 17, 2017, his grandfather passed away from congested heart failure. If you don't need resilience after all that, I don't ever know when you will. It's stories like that that make you realize that you're going in the tank in self-pity, or you're going to rise to the challenge. You're going to make life better, not only for those in your own particular family, but you're going to do what you can to help others in other places. Because that kind of pain, you don't want to see anybody go through. My own testimony is, while we were dealing with all that, I was currently working for a Reliable Life Insurance Company as an agent. One afternoon, went to a customer's house, knocked on the door, knowing that they had a pit bull dog. I was accustomed to the mother saying, let me put the dog away before she answered the door. The mother was not home that particular day. Had a storm door with no glass pane, no screen. The minute the child opened the door, pit bull dog ran out of the house, jumped in my chest. 3 years later, I was dealing with 3 blood clots, major knee surgery, and out of work. It takes resilience to bounce back from tragedy. Then again, there's 2 things you're going to do with that. You're going to drown again in your own self-pity. You're going to find a way to press forward and move forward for the benefit of yourself as well as others. Here I am 3 years without a job, but I love it, and excuse me for saying this, for those who may be offended, I love it when God take your tragedy and turn it into triumph, because he has a way of giving you a different perspective about life. With that said, I look back at why I was determined to make a difference. I moved away from Blytheville for 1 year in 2000. My son currently was just enrolled in the University of Arkansas to play football there. And through some own personal issues, I moved away to Dallas, Texas, and 1 year later, I was inspired to move back to Blytheville, Arkansas. I had currently worked for Nucor Yamato Steel. When I went back to work for them again for another 7 years after I had worked for them 7 previous years. When I went back, I was determined to look at my community, Blytheville, Arkansas, and if any of you know Blytheville, Arkansas, I hope you know it for the good and not for the negativity that may have come across the airways concerning us. We are a population of a little less than 16,000. We got some great, wonderful, powerful people in Blytheville, Arkansas. And just like Little Rock and everywhere else, it only takes a few people to give you a bad image. But we got some wonderful people in Blytheville. When I moved back, I was determined to be involved in my community. I was determined to do what I can to make a difference, to make a better community, to make a better town, or whatever you want to label it. I looked around at the things that were being done in our community in regards to children, and I never wanted to build on another man's foundation. My father always taught us, he said, listen, if somebody is doing something, don't you do the same thing. You get on there and help them do it better. So we had people who were involved in recreational activities, which I have loved all my life. I've been into sports all my life. If I wasn't preaching, I was playing ball. Well, I realized that we didn't have a feeder program for Little League football, so I took that as a challenge to gather children in and mentor a lot of young children who didn't have father figures in the home and didn't have real sound structured homes as my children had and others as well. So I implemented a Little League football program. It was a success, but it didn't achieve the goal that I was looking for. I was using that as just a vehicle to empower children to be successful. Even though I had young men in the community who was willing to volunteer their time, which was special in itself because this day and time, getting people to volunteer is not very easy. So when you get people who will, you got to be able to utilize them to the best that you possibly can. But for some reason, even though they were good at coaching football, they couldn't captivate what my vision was. Because our community, the Delta, it's been struggling academically and with poverty and low income, and many things have affected our community in a negative way. But instead of seeing the decline in what was going on, I was determined to see the glass being half full. I always believed that if it's been good once, it can be good again. If it's succeeded once, it can succeed again. You just have to have the resilience to make it come to pass. So I sat in my office one day at the church, and the thing about being a pastor is you're connected whether you want to be or not. People involve you whether you want to be involved or not. People expect you to have an answer, to aid, assist, whether you want to or not. And in all truthfulness, if you really are called to that, you want to. It's in you. You got to. And you're not satisfied until you make an impact and you make a difference, you make a change. You see a frown turn to a smile. You see something that went wrong, get turned around, headed in the right direction. That's who we are. That's what we do. I sat in my office one day and I was just conversating, talking to the Lord. I said, Lord, thank you for what you're doing with the Little League football program. I said, but it's not reaching the goal. It's not fulfilling what I had desired to see it accomplish. I heard a voice say something to me. So why don't you start a program that has nothing to do with football? He said, just like you got skills on the field, why don't you create a program called Skills Off the Field? A little light came on. Start thinking, skills off the field. Then all of a sudden I remember the commercial that at football season, basketball season, NCAA runs this commercial. You see all these different people coming on there, and they're doctors, and they're lawyers, and they're engineers, and they all kind of things, and they conclude the commercial by saying, we went pro in something other than sports. And I said, there it is. We have to inspire children to know that you don't have to be an athlete to be successful. With that in mind, I began to sit down, jot down some things that I thought were instrumental in my life that made me the person I am, and I like to think I've turned out pretty good. I'm the third of 8 children, raised by a good mother and father. My father was a fire chief at the Pine Bluff Arsenal Fire Department. My mother, she was a caregiver at home, and I applaud her for that because she was one of the best and still is. I thought about all the things my mother and my father instilled in me. My mom and dad allowed me to participate in activities at school with one thing required. I had to succeed in the classroom. If I wanted to play basketball, whatever, I had to make the grades. I didn't make the grades because I wanted to. I made the grades because I love shooting jump shots. So with that in mind, I thought about my mom made me learn how to wash clothes. I could wash white clothes so well, the old people stand out on the line and look at them. My mom made me clean the baseboards in the house. We already knew that when she put shoe shine boy on, it was time to polish the floors. And I'm not talking about with mop and glow. I'm talking about with elbows, knees, and a pad or a cloth. My mom taught me how to cook from scratch. Said, boy, you may marry somebody that looks good, smell good, talk good. Even when you hug her, she feel good. But she might not know how to cook. You need to know how to feed yourself. My dad took all 6 of his boys, stood around the car, taught us how to do mechanical work. I know how to take a transmission out of a car. I know how to put a motor back in. My point is, my parents taught us how to be well-rounded and holistic, naturally, spiritually, in every way. They taught us how to relate socially. My dad being a firefighter with the Pine Bluff Arsenal Fire Department, we learned what it was like to be in different social settings. So with all those things that were implemented in my own life, I began to jot those things down, and I said, you know what, this is what I like to see implemented in the life of every child. So we put a program together entitled Skills Off the Field. And what we did with that is we began to teach not only social, emotional components, but we also began to establish partnerships. I went to Blytheville Public Schools, in whom I had a lot of favor with the superintendent and all those who work in the school district, and they were elated to share with me in the vision of trying to help make our community better. One reason they were excited about that is because out of the 250 school districts, currently our school district ranks 235. It's not anything we're proud of, but guess what? I don't see us going down, I see us going up. Well, with all that in mind, we were able to partner with our school district. We were able to partner with Project Lunch. We were able to partner with a couple of other churches in the community. And we created a program, after school, summer enrichment program. But I didn't just want to create another after school program. I wanted to change the image of after school programs. In our area, after school programs are defined as a place for kids to go where parents can get an extra hour and a half to do whatever they feel they need to do. A place where kids go and for the most part all they do is play. We wanted to change that image. I was blessed to marry a woman who has been in education for 20 years, and I knew I had the right somebody that could help me do what I wanted to do. She understood the needs of children. She taught kindergarten for 14 years. Now she's currently teaching second grade. So even though I had the vision, I didn't necessarily know how to implement it. So I went to my resources. And I got them to share with me things that they think was necessary and required for us to be successful. After hearing all of their opinions and all their suggestions, we put a plan together. And we've been able to make a difference in our children's lives. One thing that we struggled with was a lack of parental involvement. I came up with a solution that seems to be working. When I grew up, you had one telephone in the house. And most of the times we had party lines. So I could hear my friends' conversation even when I wasn't invited. It was unwanted communication, but it was yet communication. As much as I appreciate the smartphone, email, and all these things, in some aspect it's a negative because it's killed our personal communication one with another. So what I decided to do is, you know what? We're going to bring simplicity back. Our parents are busy doing all that they can to work, provide for their children, trying to do their best to make a good home. In most cases, it's a single parent. In most cases, it's a mother. I don't think it's a lack of disinterest on our parents. I just think that when you live in a low economic society, you don't make enough money through one job that you got to work 2 or 3, there's only so much time you have allotted to do what you need to do. Most of our parents are not highly educated. Most of them don't have college degrees. And if you haven't gone through those channels of improving yourself, you know very little about structure and time management. So, just as much as we wanted to help our children, we felt like we had to help our parents. Every parent loves a child. Sometimes they don't know how to love the child beyond putting clothes on their back, a roof over their head, and food on the table. That's where we come in. We created a way to make our parents accountable. And if a parent's going to be accountable to anything, they're going to be accountable to their own children. So to make a long story short, I don't want them to have to pull my coattail. We know what that's like. We began to have our parents commit themselves one-on-one. Every day that they come in to sign their kid out, I don't give them a piece of paper as a reminder. We talk one-on-one as a reminder. Most of them don't keep a planner like most of us do. We know when our time slots, what our schedules are, where we got to be, when we got to be. Most of them are just trying to do the best they can with what they have. So we were successful because we implemented the person-to-person communication again. And with that, we were able to implement a program that not only focused on the educational aspects and the social and emotional aspects, it focused on linking parent and child together again. And, you know, kids are just truthful. I would give them something to have their parent to read to them or something or whatever, and then when the parent come in, I'd ask the parent to make sure they do it, and then the next day when they come back, I ask the kid, did they get it done? He said, she didn't read to me. Well, when the parent come in, I hand it to him again. So you gave me this yesterday. I said, yeah, but you didn't read it last night. The parent looked at me like, but you know what? Instead of it getting a negative vibe from it, I got a smile and I got involvement. And I think if we get back to what we know as roots of many, many years gone by, it's not the sharing of a cup of sugar that it was 25 years ago or a stick of butter. It's a sharing of communication, information, love, and care for one another. We do those things again, we'll not only be resilient in our own lives, we'll be resilient in the lives of others. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk with you a little bit about our experience in Tennessee, in part because we're excited about what we've done in Tennessee, and in part because I see a similar kind of enthusiasm here in Arkansas. And I hope some of the things that we've done and some of the lessons we've learned can help you in changing that enthusiasm into greater and greater effect as you try to address adverse childhood experiences in your state. As 2015 began in Tennessee, there were a lot of things going on in our state related to adverse childhood experiences. In Memphis, an effort to improve the outcomes of early children had grown into the ACES Foundation for Shelby County. A similar effort was occurring in Nashville. We had some very effective spokespeople that were talking all across the state about the concept of adversity and the impact of adverse childhood experiences. My own agency, the Commission on Children and Youth, was trying to provide venues and to continue that conversation. We brought Dr. Robert Andan in 2014 and introduced the ACES concept to over 600 Tennessee child advocates across the state. We also continued our work with the Frameworks Institute, which is a communications consultancy that was helping to build, well, in fact, you've heard their messages today, the idea of serve and return, the idea of toxic stress. These were messages that were developed from research that was done by the Frameworks Institute. Our Department of Health had made adverse childhood experiences a core concept for early childhood health promotion. We were doing continuing surveys about the incidence of adverse childhood experiences among our citizens. We had philanthropies that were being cultivated and were beginning to invest their resources in the efforts to reduce the occurrence of adversity. Our state was implementing the Three Branches Institute, which is a model that brings representatives from the legislative, executive, and judicial branches together to talk about issues that impact children and policy responses that can be beneficial in addressing those issues. And in the midst of all that, Governor Bill Haslam appointed a new deputy governor to be chief of staff in his office. Now, typically, a staff appointment, even one in the governor's office, doesn't seem to have a whole lot to do with adverse childhood experiences. But Deputy Governor Jim Henry happened to have been the former commissioner of the Department of Children's Services. And Deputy Governor Henry had been part of that developing conversation about adverse childhood experiences in our state. And he brought that message to the governor's office. And this is a governor who had been already dedicated to improving child well-being as one of the priorities of his administration. This turned into a flashpoint for all those many things that we have been doing, because while there was a lot going on, people were going in a lot of directions. They weren't necessarily going in a single direction. But that flashpoint of Governor Henry taking the message to the governor's office resulted in some of those people who were doing so much being brought together. As they came together, they were talking about a summit of leaders across the state to talk about adverse childhood experiences and talking about what next steps might be available to the governor. And in November of 2015, that summit occurred, and Governor Haslam took one of those next steps. He declared Building Strong Brains Tennessee. BSBT was to be a 3-year initiative, an initiative to increase awareness about childhood experiences and the impact that it has across all facets of health among ourselves, among our families, friends, and our neighbors. And it was to encourage and to equip communities for action to prevent and mitigate the impact of adverse childhood experiences. As we have worked toward those two goals, this mission has emerged for Building Strong Brains Tennessee. And I want you to note that at the core of this mission is this idea of culture change. That's because we recognize that successful efforts to address adverse childhood experiences means that we have to reconsider the values that are represented in our policies and the services that we provide to people who are impacted by adversity. It requires us to shift our perspective about the process, the perspective that we bring to the process of setting policy and designing those services. And most importantly for me, it requires that we develop a common language that supports, and even more importantly, does not distract from, a true appreciation about adversity. You notice in the mission also our 4 Ps. These are central ideas about how we approach the work that we do. The 4 Ps of philosophy, policy, programs, and practices. They represent the depth of change that we feel needs to occur. But more importantly, it also represents the range of change that must occur, because as you see, we're concerned not simply about a few partners in the state. We're concerned about all of the organizations, all of the groups, all of the communities that are impacted by adverse childhood experiences just as much as our citizens who are affected are, and who benefit when the incidence and the effect of ACEs is reduced as a result. One of our foundational principles is this concept of knowledge mobilization. Knowledge mobilization begins with the fact that there is opportunity for ingenuity. There is opportunity for innovation. Knowledge mobilization has tools of ingenuity, and it looks at the opportunities of innovation. The tools are the expertise, the experience, the resources, certainly those that have occurred with the great growth of neuroscience, brain science. But we also recognize that there is a wealth of experience, there is a wealth of expertise, and there's a wealth of evidence within our own state, among our own people, and that we need to provide opportunity, the prospect for those tools of ingenuity to be used, and to be used for aligning research, policy, and programs to address adverse childhood experiences. We can accomplish this when we bring people together, when we can raise awareness about change and to prompt change, and when we put that knowledge into action. I get caught up now. One of the things that has occurred as we've pursued efforts in regard to adverse childhood experiences in Tennessee at Building Strong Brains is the fact that we've had a building of confidence. That confidence has allowed us to move away from the question of what is wrong with you to the question of what's happened to you. Dr. Penderhughes this morning has reminded me that we perhaps need to make that question a bit different, not just what happened to you, but what's happening to you. Again, this goes back to a process of culture change. It's not simply that we ask the question or that we change the questions, but there's so much more in the background that goes along with changing that question. We like the metaphor of building with Building Strong Brains, obviously. It's critically important to the idea of brain architecture, and that's one of the powerful metaphors as part of our strategic communication strategy for talking about adverse childhood experiences. But we're not simply talking about building in regard to the individual's brain. We're talking about building in terms of the broader community as well. It begins with the foundation of healthy child development. That foundation is one that we can put additional pillars on: educational achievement, lifelong health, economic productivity, responsible citizenship. Those are important because they allow us to top it off with succeeding in parenting a next generation. And when we talk about parenting a next generation, we're not simply talking about who the caregivers of a child, what they do. We're talking about parenting in the broad sense, that it is an aspect of community, that we all contribute to the parenting of every child in our state. The reason we're concerned about a successful next generation is the fact that it is the foundation for prosperity. Prosperity in the sense of quality of life and quality of relationships, but also prosperity in the sense of a healthy and effective economy. Quickly go through some milestones here as we've worked in Tennessee. You notice that November 15th was that first summit that I mentioned to you. March 16th and then May 16th, May of 16, we introduced Frame Labs and symposia, science symposia about adverse childhood experiences. The Frame Labs were actually workshops to train individuals in that strategic communications messaging that we have developed about adverse childhood experiences. But more importantly, it turned into a leadership development opportunity because we brought folks together and we gave them that common message and, more importantly, the common language to talk about adverse childhood experiences across the state. In May of 2016, we got a very nice surprise from our General Assembly. I'm sure there was some whispering in the ears, but it wasn't a great effort at advocacy when our General Assembly decided to provide $1.2 million for Building Strong Brains. In 2017, Governor Haslam added that $1.2 million to his budget, non-recurring item, but the General Assembly again agreed and maintained that funding. And then this past year, Governor Haslam kind of upped things a little bit. He increased it to $2.4 million as a recurring budget item. And again, the General Assembly concurred with that. So we've been very fortunate in having a number of resources that we've been able to apply to Building Strong Brains. In October of 16, the Commission on Children and Youth had been invited to develop a Building Strong Brains curriculum, a tool that could be used for talking about adverse childhood experiences and the impact across the state. We completed that curriculum and began a process, a series of training for trainers. Again, leadership development to give folks an opportunity to speak effectively in their communities about adverse childhood experiences. To date, we've done over 25 training for trainers. We have trained 800 folks across the state of Tennessee to present the Building Strong Brains curriculums and components from as little as 15 minutes out to 3 hours. We're beginning another series next month of training for trainers, and we'll be adding an additional 200 folks, more than 1,000 people who are carrying the message of Building Strong Brains across the state. In January of 2018, one of the things we had done with innovation grants that I'll mention in a moment, we had commissioned one of our local public broadcasting stations to develop ACES, the Tennessee Story, a 6-part series about adverse childhood experiences that was presented by every public broadcasting station across the state. Still available online, and I'll be happy to share information about where you can find that. Interestingly enough, Governor Haslam was interested enough in the project that he actually provided the introduction for each of those 6 segments that occurred. One of the most exciting things that we've been able to accomplish with Building Strong Brains are our innovation grants. You can see the first in August 16, again in May 17, and then in May of this year. We issued grants for folks who were demonstrating new technology, new methods, bringing those tools of ingenuity to bear on the opportunities of innovation. To date, we've funded some 56 projects. Just a couple of weeks ago, we also had a summit celebrating the successes that we've been able to see over the time with Building Strong Brains. We've been fortunate in Tennessee that our Department of Health has made ongoing efforts to evaluate the incidence of adverse childhood experiences across the state and to promote the information. As a result, we know, fortunately, unfortunately, that 61% of Tennesseans are impacted by at least one adverse childhood experience. 27% of them have had 3 or more of the adverse experiences. And of course, that 3 is a break point where the risk, your susceptibility to the variety of health problems associated with adverse childhood experiences increases markedly. We have been involved in advocacy about ACEs in Tennessee, but it's not been very high-level advocacy in the sense that we've not had to push very hard. We've had so much interest and so much desire to address the problem that our advocacy has been a little low-key. In these last 3 years, a great deal of the advocacy has been among our partners, among ourselves who are involved in the effort to address adverse childhood experiences, because we are very much dedicated to the idea of using common language and common message. And it was kind of necessary to get all of those diverse folks headed in the same direction and speaking the same words about adversity. There was some degree of advocacy in regard to the funding that I mentioned to you, but again, we had such support in our General Assembly that it was more a matter of pointing out what we had accomplished, and they were willing to come forward and continue to support the efforts that we were making. We've worked very hard to recognize the existing assets that impact adverse childhood experiences. Too often when people start talking about adversity, there is a perception that we're doing something new, that we've got to invent the ACEs program, when in fact, what we need to do is recognize what's already occurring that's contributing to the prevention and mitigation of adverse childhood experiences, providing the culture of change where those can be brought to the forefront, and continuing to sustain the support of those who are already making efforts to improve adversity in our community. We have been looking particularly a little more strongly with advocacies in regard to several particular programs that have required attention in Tennessee. Efforts to continue building out and returning some funding for our home visiting programs. Our General Assembly has been very interested in the Safe Baby Court concept, established 2 pilot programs, recently expanded that by additional 5 programs, and there's been advocacy to continue the effort to build out those services, and also to provide assistance with the infant mental health efforts that are going on in Tennessee. And finally, the innovation grants that I mentioned to you, the 56 that we've done, and they've been extremely varied. In my region of the state that I work in, we've had 4 that were funded this year. One of them is a training program for the Jackson, Tennessee Police Department to make them aware of the impact of police operations on children, to train them to be responsive in terms of reducing the toxic experience of children who may be subject to police operations. We have a school system that is putting mindfulness and peace corners in place across all the schools that in that particular school system. We have a program that's targeting Head Starts in yet another county. And finally, going back to Jackson again, a program that engages families who are involved with our juvenile court and helping them to appreciate the existence of adversity in their lives and how that might impact their success and particularly their child's success in regard to the juvenile court. Last slide. If you have any questions about what we're doing, if you would like to know more about Tennessee's efforts, you can go to the website there at tccy-aces. And as always, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to give me a call. I'd be happy to talk with you. Thanks.
Thank you. Now let's give all of our panelists a round of applause. As you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to use Rodger's slides to gather us back up. There you go. Thank you. Good slides. So it sort of strikes me that as the panelists have talked across personal experiences and this question about policy and the programs that you're developing, and the philosophy and approach, that we actually did a good job of covering Rodger's graphic, right? Sara helped us with this idea that the narrative change that we've got to be about is the only way to help people understand this whole philosophy, because in essence, people think people are responsible for what people do, right? But if we're going to develop a philosophy that helps us as a state move forward, then we're going to have to do this narrative change. She's a wonderful spokesperson for that. Rex talked about policies and funding, right? That this idea that it's about what we're doing, whether you're an educator or you're a health person or whatever, but it's also about what our economic development people are doing. It gets back to what Dr. Penderhughes talked about creating communities and building the infrastructure that helps to build this resilience. And then the pastor talked about the programs and services, one that he was involved in, but then what he's developing that's actually engaging parents. And then our friend from Tennessee, I think, actually just helped us believe that it's all possible, right? That there's actually some things that we can do that actually can push public policy to a place where we're getting some resources invested, where you're not having to argue about whether it's true or not, right? So questions, and I'll run the mic around. We got a couple minutes. I got questions. But let's just go back to the beginning. You talked about, I got 1,000 questions for all of you, and I got 1,000 questions for you, but let me ask just one. How does your framing around narrative change, how does that play across groups, right?
Right.
This is the choir, right?
Hi, choir.
But how does it play in other places? I'm curious.
Well, it's all about audiences, right? And knowing, I think one of the things I do in my work with not just communication students, but also nonprofits involved in advocacy work is to point out the fact that it's not as important as what you say than it is what people hear, right? And what people hear changes across communities. The conversations I have in New York with my peers in the private funding world and in the nonprofit world. I come from a refugee background. I worked at the International Rescue Committee for years in New York. And you know, those conversations are, if I can say, more advanced in many ways, and so we can use language that is shared, that is not offensive, because there are more shared values in that conversation. Moving to Arkansas was, on many levels, a big change, as you can imagine. And so in my work with groups, I think a lot of times I have to adjust what I say because the audience isn't necessarily primed to hear it. And I'm very conscious of triggers, and I borrow from Frameworks Institute quite a bit in my work. You know, you have to be aware of those triggers. And so when you talk about social programs, you have to know that in the audiences in these communities, what people hear is that dominant frame of individualism and individual responsibility. Some communities may hear privilege, but you noticed I didn't use that word, and that's conscious. Because the word privilege, for where we are right now, I think in the communities that I speak to, it usually inspires a very defensive posture. So it's not productive. So as much as I want to advance the conversation and speed us up so that we're all on the same level, you can't do that. These things take time. And as much as we're all looking for those silver bullets, I still really believe that change happens by people talking to people over and over and over again. So is that helpful?
It is. And Rodger, and this is actually a question for Rex, but I'm going to preface it by a comment to you. You know, you talked about, it is for you, Rex. You talked about training 1,000 people, right? In this building a better brain work, and you talked about getting on common message. Rex, you talked about what our politicians do. What happens when 1,000 or 2,000 people in Arkansas start saying the same thing?
It can make a difference, obviously. I mean, we're a small state. We're only 3 million people. And a lot of what I talked about, Cory, was a mindset change. You know, one thing, and I'm born and raised here, I'm just going to plan to spend the rest of my life here. I dearly love Arkansas. But one thing about Arkansas is we love the smell of asphalt and concrete in the morning. We like to build things. And we need to get away so much from building things and start building people in Arkansas. I mean, we can put a highway program out there and it usually passes on the ballot. You know, we like that asphalt, we like that concrete. Most of our big philanthropic gifts, if you look at Arkansas, what are they for? They're to build a building, right, on a college campus. And I'm not saying not build anything new, but we need to shift that somewhat from building things to building people. And that comes back to the education and healthcare that I was hitting on.
Right. 1,000 people, right? Telling people.
That can make a huge difference.
So,
100, from my years in the governor's office, 100 people. You have 100 people show up at the Capitol during a legislative session, even that can
That
make
makes
a
a
difference.
difference.
Amen.
Pastor, in your programmatic thing, and you stop me when we need to stop. I know it's lunchtime. Okay, so I got one question for Pastor and one more for Rodger, and then we'll stop. Pastor, you talked about in your program this idea about engaging parents. Do you think in engaging parents in the programmatic stuff that you're doing that you might be able to get them to be a part of this chorus of voices that begins to talk to your city council, that begins to talk to your county quorum court, that begins to talk to your legislator?
Most certainly, because once people become enlightened, they become more involved. And if you want to see change, then it has to come from the people in whom our cities are basically, they're serving. So, I mean, when we work to get parents involved, we want them to know that they're not just a number among our community. They're a valid asset of our community. So there's a lot of things, a lot of ideas, suggestions, and things that could make the community better as a whole. A lot of them are hidden right in the confines of those people who have never expressed a voice because they never knew they had one. And when you get them involved, you begin to discover new treasures and new thoughts and ideas that might not have come from me or you or anybody else. So I hope that answers
That's the
the
most
question.
important thing. And then Rodger, and this is back to the hope thing. Tennessee, $1 million 2 years ago, $1 million another year, $2.3 million last year. You're doing all this stuff. You got a new institute. It sounds like Tennessee is run by a cadre of like left-wing, crazy progressive liberals that are just about spending money and putting money in the hands of poor folks. Is that true?
Why, sure. You've been seeing our political campaign ads recently, I take it. No, of course it's not true. But, the issue of adverse childhood experiences isn't partisan. I mean, one of the important messages that is in our strategy is this concept of prosperity. And I'll go back to it again. When you are dealing with adverse childhood experiences, yes, you're doing wonderful things for children. You're doing wonderful things for families. But you are doing things that benefit the community, the state, and the economy of both of those. And we need to start talking, as Rex said, we need to start talking to economic and community development people rather than just them being foreigners out there that occasionally we pass by. We need to talk about adverse childhood experiences as an economic development issue. It is. And similarly, we need to talk about economic development as something that impacts and contributes to adverse community experiences, as Dr. Penderhughes told us this morning. We need to get that conversation going back and forth. And very often, we don't have conversations with many people in the community because we don't invite them. We don't invite our representatives from the legislature. We don't invite our representatives from senior levels of the executive branch, from the judicial branch. When we had our first summit, we had all kinds of folks who were there, and I had the opportunity to sit there and watch the Chief Justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court playing the brain game with all the other folks at their table. So they were sitting there building their brain. That's something you need to consider. We talk about adverse childhood experiences. We need to give them an opportunity to talk about adverse childhood experiences as well.
Thank you. Thank you again to the panel, and we appreciate y'all's patience.